frightening true horror story from the depths of night. The night was thick with fog. It clung to the trees like a heavy blanket. Sarah walked slowly, her footsteps muffled by the soft earth. She wasn't sure why she'd come here, but something had drawn her in. The old house stood ahead, its silhouette barely visible through the mist. It had been abandoned for years. Or so they said. She had heard the stories, whispers from the locals. Strange things happening. People who never came back. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer to the front door. It was ajar. She froze. The door was old, peeling. The wood groaned under the slightest touch, and yet it had opened on its own. A strange chill ran down her spine. She wanted to turn back, but her legs refused to obey. Something was calling her inside. The air smelled of decay, thick and musty. She stepped into the dark foyer. The floor creaked under her weight. Each step was heavy, as if the house itself was waiting. The walls were covered in cracked wallpaper, faded to an almost sickly yellow. There was a faint sound, like something dragging along the floor. A scraping noise that made her heart race. She wasn't alone. The darkness seemed to close in on her. Her pulse quickened as she moved deeper into the house. The scraping sound grew louder. And then, silence. Suddenly, a soft whisper broke the stillness. "Leave." It was a breathy voice, barely audible. But it was unmistakable. A chill gripped her. She spun around. Nothing. Only the oppressive darkness, pressing in on all sides. Her heart pounded. She reached for her phone, but it slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. The light flickered, casting shadows that twisted unnaturally. A figure appeared in the doorway. A man. Or something that resembled a man. His face was pale, his eyes sunken. He took a step forward. And then another. The air grew cold, the temperature dropping as if she were standing in an open grave. His mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. "You're too late," he whispered. The walls seemed to breathe with him, pulsing with a life of their own. A scream built in her chest. But it never came. The man reached out. His fingers cold as ice, brushing her skin. And then everything went dark. The silence was suffocating. The house, the mist, the man, gone. Just like the others before her. She was lost to the night. Forever. The darkness lingered. No sound. No movement. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, but there was nothing to breathe. It was as if the very air had vanished. Her eyes snapped open, but all she saw was black. Cold, thick blackness. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed whole. She couldn't move. Her limbs felt like they were weighed down by an invisible force, heavy and unyielding. Then, from the far corner of her mind, something stirred. A memory. A fleeting thought. She remembered the whispers. The warnings. "Don't go inside," they had said. But now it was too late. Her skin crawled as she felt something brush against her. A cold, damp presence. It circled her like a predator, just out of reach. She couldn't see it, but she could feel its eyes on her. It wanted her. She could feel its hunger. Her heart pounded louder than ever, thudding painfully in her chest. And then, she felt it. A hand. Cold and clammy. It wrapped around her wrist, pulling her forward. She gasped, her body jerking against the invisible force holding her. But the grip tightened. She tried to twist free, but it was useless. Her feet dragged across the ground as she was pulled deeper into the suffocating darkness. Her head spun. She couldn't tell which direction she was going anymore. Everywhere she turned, the walls of the house seemed to move. Closing in on her. She wanted to escape, but there was no escape. The air thickened, pressing against her chest. Her throat closed as the hand dragged her through the unseen corridors. Each step was slower than the last. Her body grew weaker. The cold seeped deeper into her bones. She could feel the presence moving behind her. Closer. Closer. A whisper, barely audible, tickled her ear. "You're mine now." And then, silence again. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of something waiting. Something that had been here far longer than she ever would. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her entirely was the pale face of the man, grinning from the shadows. Her last breath was a ragged gasp. Then, nothing. Just the cold, endless night. The cold was absolute. A stillness, deeper than death itself, wrapped around her. It was as if time had stopped, or perhaps it had never existed here at all. Sarah tried to move again, but her body refused to obey. Her limbs felt numb, unresponsive, as though they were part of the shadows themselves. She couldn't remember how long it had been. Minutes? Hours? Days? It was impossible to tell. But something had changed. The silence began to pulse. A rhythmic, steady beat. A sound that grew louder with each passing moment. It wasn't her heartbeat. It was something else. A whisper. No, not a whisper. A chant. Low and guttural, it came from all around her, wrapping her in its unnatural cadence. The words were indecipherable, but they felt ancient, so ancient they made her skin crawl. The temperature dropped further, until it felt as though her very soul was being frozen. And then, a sound, different, sharper, split through the air. A low, wet slithering. She felt something brush past her legs, slick and cold. Her heart skipped, but still, she couldn't move. Not even a twitch. Whatever it was, it had noticed her. She could feel it. It was studying her, circling her, as if waiting for something. But what? Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. The floor wasn't solid anymore. It was breathing. The earth itself seemed alive, shifting with a deep, primal pulse. A crack appeared in the darkness before her, a thin line of light that cut through the void. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed before it could form. The crack widened, revealing a vast chasm, black and endless, filled with swirling mist. She didn't have to look down to know what was in it. She could feel it. A void. An abyss. A hunger that would never be satisfied. Then, a cold voice spoke again, this time right beside her ear. "Welcome home." The breath on her neck was foul, a mixture of rot and decay. The voice was familiar now, the same voice she had heard before, when she first stepped into the house. The man. The figure in the shadows. But there was something different. Something darker about it now. His breath, ice-cold and sharp, sent shivers down her spine. "You're part of it now," he whispered. "The night owns you." Before she could fully process the words, the floor beneath her gave way. With a sickening lurch, she was pulled into the chasm, her body falling into the endless darkness. Her screams echoed, but no one would hear them. No one could. The last thing she felt was the cold, suffocating grip of the abyss closing in around her. And then, there was nothing. Nothing. The emptiness stretched on forever, an unbroken silence. Sarah's mind was blank, her thoughts tangled, unformed. She couldn't feel her body. No sensation. No pain. Just absence. Then, a flicker. A faint pulse, far away, like the distant beat of a dying heart. It grew closer. She could feel it now. A presence. It wasn't the darkness. It wasn't the cold. It was something else. A whisper began again, but this time, it wasn't from the figure in the shadows. It was from within her. "Wake up." The voice was low, but urgent. Sarah tried to respond, but her lips wouldn't move. She couldn't even open her eyes. "Wake up, before it's too late." The words grew louder, more desperate. There was a sharpness to them now, a frantic energy. She felt herself shifting, her limbs, her body, her mind, fighting against the endless pull of the void. With a violent jerk, she gasped. Her chest filled with air. Cold, bitter air. She blinked. Her eyes opened. The darkness was gone. She was no longer falling. She was standing, her feet on solid ground. The house. The one she had wandered into, not so long ago. But it was different now. The walls were cracked and bleeding. The floors groaned beneath her feet as though the house itself was alive. The air smelled of rot, foul and heavy. And then, she saw him. The man. He stood in the doorway, watching her. His face was pale, like a corpse that had been dead for too long. His eyes, empty. Black pits. But they fixed on her, unblinking. She could feel his presence, suffocating, crawling under her skin. He didn't move, didn't speak. Just stared. The words came back to her, though she didn't want to hear them again. You're part of it now. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her legs wavered beneath her, threatening to collapse. She tried to turn and run, but the moment she took a step, the house groaned louder, as if trying to stop her. The walls seemed to close in on her, narrowing, bending. Her pulse quickened. You can't leave. The voice was his, but it wasn't his. It was the house. It was the darkness. It was the night. You belong here. Sarah reached for the door, her hand trembling. She could see the outside, faintly glowing in the distance, the mist still hanging in the air. She wanted to escape. She had to escape. But as her fingers touched the doorknob, a cold hand closed around her wrist. His grip was icy, unrelenting. Too late, he whispered, his voice echoing in the blackened room. You're already here. She felt herself being pulled back into the heart of the house. And for the first time, Sarah understood. The house wasn't just alive. It was hunting. It didn't just trap people, it kept them. She couldn't run. She couldn't hide. She was part of it now. And it would never let her go. The grip on her wrist tightened, sending a jolt of icy terror through her body. The hand was cold, impossibly cold, like the touch of death itself. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her legs were like lead, frozen in place. She wanted to scream, but the air in her lungs had been stolen. Her voice was nothing but a trapped echo inside her throat. The man's hollow eyes never left her. His lips curled into a cruel smile, and in that moment, Sarah realized the smile wasn't for her. It was for the house. The house that was hungry. The house that had been waiting for her, just as it had waited for all the others before her. The walls creaked. The floor groaned, almost alive, as if it was shifting beneath her. Something whispered through the darkness again, a voice older than time. She's ours now. It wasn't just the man anymore. The house had a voice too, 1,000 voices merging into one. She felt a coldness spread through her veins as the whispers filled her mind. We've waited so long. It was suffocating. The weight of it crushed her, the very presence of the house pressing down on her chest. She wanted to run. She wanted to escape. But every instinct in her body screamed that it was useless. It was always useless. The darkness here had no end. It had no escape. And then, something terrible happened. The shadows in the room began to stir. They twisted and undulated, forming shapes, figures, things that were not quite human but not quite anything else either. They slithered out of the corners, crawling toward her, stretching toward her, wrapping around her ankles, her legs. Her heart raced, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But there was no escaping. The air turned thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The walls shuddered. And in the distance, the faintest sound of something scratching at the floor. It wasn't her mind playing tricks. She felt it. A scraping. A movement. Something was moving closer, inch by inch. Let her see. The voice, his asterisk voice, came again, but now it was almost amused. Before Sarah could react, a cold hand grabbed her face, tilting her head back. Her eyes were forced open wide, her vision blurry, but then a crack appeared in the ceiling above her. A thin line of light. And from the crack, something dropped. A long, twisted shape. A figure, black as ink, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. It slithered toward her like a serpent. Sarah recoiled, but the grip on her face tightened, forcing her to watch. Her pulse thudded in her ears as the creature drew closer, its mouth opening wide, *2 wide star. It whispered, though its voice was more like a rasp, like old paper tearing. "You belong here with us, forever." The room seemed to close in around her, the air thick and suffocating. She tried to scream, but it was swallowed by the vast, unrelenting darkness. Her vision blurred, her body sinking into the blackness, the shadows pulling her under. No escape. No light. No end. The whispering grew louder, drowning out everything else. The last thing Sarah saw before the dark consumed her completely was the smile of the man who had become a part of the house. His grin was wide now, stretching impossibly, as if he too was merging into the house, becoming one with it. And then, the silence. The never-ending, suffocating silence. The silence was oppressive. It stretched out, thick and suffocating, until Sarah could feel it pressing against her skin, choking the air from her lungs. Her body had stopped resisting. There was no point in struggling anymore. The shadows had claimed her, just as they had claimed so many before her. But somewhere deep inside, a spark of defiance still flickered. It was weak. Faint. But it was there. Sarah's eyes opened again, though the world around her remained cloaked in darkness. The house was everywhere. It was in her mind, her bones, her blood. The air tasted of rot and despair. Her fingers twitched. She was still here. She wasn't entirely lost. Not yet. The whispers, the voices, the endless murmurs of the house, they pressed into her mind, but Sarah pushed them back. For a fleeting moment, she felt something more than just the presence of the house. A flicker of light. A glimpse of something else. A way out. It was barely a thought. A whisper in the back of her mind. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it. A doorway. An escape. The house tried to stop her, to drown her in the endless tide of voices, but the light grew stronger. It was like a small pulse in the void. A heartbeat. Her heartbeat. The house trembled. The walls shuddered. The cold grip on her wrist loosened, if only slightly. Sarah took a slow, deep breath. She focused all her energy on that tiny pulse of light. She reached out, not with her hands, but with her mind. She had to will herself into it, had to push beyond the suffocating weight of the darkness. Move. Escape. Live, The shadows screeched, a horrible, bone-rattling sound, as if the house itself was tearing apart. The grip on her wrist tightened again, but she resisted. A single step. Another. The light grew, pulling her forward. Her vision cleared. The man, no longer a man but an empty shell, watched her, his face twisted in an expression of rage and confusion. He didn't understand. He didn't know that she was already leaving. His hands reached out, but they were too slow. Too late. A blinding light erupted around her, piercing through the darkness. She felt herself being pulled away, dragged through time and space, her body tearing free from the grasp of the house. The walls groaned one last time. Then, there was a flash of brilliance, and everything went white. For a moment, she felt weightless, unanchored, suspended in nothingness. And then, suddenly, her feet hit solid ground. The air was crisp, clean. The fog was gone. The house was gone. Sarah stood alone, gasping for breath, as the world around her slowly came into focus. She was outside. The mist had dissipated, the moon shining brightly above. The house was no longer there, no longer looming in the distance. There was no sign it had ever existed. She stumbled forward, her legs unsteady, her heart still racing. It was over. She had escaped. But as she glanced back one last time, a cold chill swept over her. A whisper echoed in the back of her mind. You can never truly leave. The ground beneath her feet trembled slightly, as if the house had left its mark on her. And for the briefest moment, she thought she saw it, the outline of a shadow, just at the edge of her vision. But when she turned to look, there was nothing. No house. No man. Just the cold, quiet night. But deep inside, she knew. It wasn't truly gone. The house would always be waiting. And one day, it would call her back. And next time, there would be no escape. The night air felt thick against Sarah's skin, as though the world itself had become heavy, suffused with an eerie presence. Her pulse still raced, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the house's grip. She stood there, in the middle of the barren landscape, eyes scanning the empty space where the house once stood. Nothing. No remnants. No trace. But she could still feel it. The pull. The whisper. It lingered in her bones, settling into her soul. She shook her head, trying to clear it, trying to force the memory of the house from her mind. But it wouldn't go away. It couldn't. It was as though she'd never really left. As if the house had merely released her for now, giving her the illusion of freedom. It's not over, she thought. Her feet moved before she could tell them to stop. Her legs carried her down the path, toward the trees, toward the edge of the forest. She hadn't realized she was walking in the direction of the old road until it was too late. It felt like an instinct. A compulsion. And then, it happened. A cold gust of wind swept through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. Sarah froze. Her heart slammed against her chest as the whispers returned, soft, insidious, tickling the back of her mind. Come back. The words weren't a command this time, but a plea. A call. She stood motionless, her breath catching in her throat. Her instincts screamed at her to turn around. To run. But something inside her, something dark, pulled her toward it. Toward the voice. Toward the house. A distant, low hum vibrated through the ground, like the resonance of a living thing, its breath deep and slow. Sarah clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She knew she had to turn away. She knew she had to leave. But her legs wouldn't listen. Her body moved forward, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. She passed through the trees, pushing forward, the fog creeping back, curling around her like a living entity. The mist thickened. The air grew colder. And then, through the swirling fog, she saw it. The house. It stood there, just as it had before, towering and ominous, its windows like hollow eyes watching her every move. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. She had just left. But there it was. She tried to scream, but her throat was dry, the words stuck inside her. You've come back. The voice wasn't the same as before. It was softer, almost familiar. It was the house speaking, yes, but it also sounded like someone else, someone she knew. A faint silhouette appeared in the doorway. A figure, shadowed and indistinct, but unmistakably human. Her heart skipped. It couldn't be. Not him. Not him, too. But there was no denying it. The man, the one she had seen in the house, in the shadows, was standing there. He was grinning again, the same cold, dead smile. And behind him, the house seemed to breathe, the walls shifting ever so slightly, as if alive. You thought you escaped. But you never do. The wind howled around her, colder now, biting at her skin. The shadows reached out, curling around her ankles, pulling her toward the house. Her mind screamed, no. No, I won't go back, But her feet kept moving forward, drawn to the house as if by some magnetic force. With every step, the house seemed to grow larger, more oppressive, like a massive weight settling on her chest. She stopped at the threshold. The door creaked open, beckoning her inside. But before she could move, the man spoke again. You don't have a choice. The words echoed in her ears, and for a moment, everything inside her went still. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed the others. And now, she was part of it. There would be no escape. She stepped into the darkness. The door slammed shut behind her. And as the house swallowed her whole once again, a cold smile spread across her face. Because she finally understood. The house didn't just take people. It made them. And now, she was a part of it. Forever. The door slammed with a deafening finality. The sound echoed through the emptiness, vibrating deep within Sarah's chest. For a moment, everything was still. Silent. The cold air of the night was gone, replaced by an oppressive warmth that seemed to seep into her very bones. The shadows danced around her, twisting and writhing like living creatures, but she couldn't look away. She could feel it now. The house was inside her, coursing through her veins, filling the spaces between her ribs. She wasn't just a visitor anymore. She was part of the house. The walls seemed to pulse, beating with an ancient, rhythmic thrum. The air felt thick with forgotten memories, whispers from every corner, voices from 1,000 years ago. The house was alive. It had always been alive. Sarah's eyes darted to the hallway ahead. The familiar, dark stretch of walls that led to the heart of the house. The same twisting, suffocating corridors. But this time, something was different. She was no longer lost in it. The house knew her. She could feel it. It was calling to her. As if she had always belonged here. Her feet moved of their own accord, following the silent command of the house, down the narrow hall. She could feel the walls pressing in on her, but it didn't matter. She had already surrendered. And somehow, she felt peaceful. Her thoughts were no longer her own. They were drowned by the house, by its ancient presence, its pull. As she passed the darkened rooms, she glimpsed shapes moving in the corners of her vision. Figures, human and not, watching her with hollow eyes. Some of them seemed to be reaching out, but they were mere shadows now, fading into the walls. "You've finally returned." The voice wasn't the man's anymore. It was the house itself. Low and deep, like the rumble of thunder. Sarah's hand brushed the wall, feeling the smooth, almost liquid texture beneath her fingertips. The house was breathing. She could feel it. It was alive. A door appeared at the end of the hallway. It was like every other door in this place, old, warped, and worn by time. But now, it was different. It pulsed, faintly, as if alive with something darker than before. She reached out, almost instinctively, and turned the handle. The door swung open. Inside, a single light flickered, casting long shadows across the room. It was empty. At first, it appeared to be an ordinary room, dusty, decayed, just like every other part of the house. But as she stepped inside, she felt the change. A cold breeze swirled around her, and the shadows in the room stretched and distorted, forming shapes that no longer belonged in the human world. And in the center of the room, asterisk. The figure was a mirror image of Sarah, standing in the very same place, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth open as if she were about to scream. But she didn't. The other Sarah's face twisted into a cruel, dark grin. It was a smile that wasn't her, that wasn't human. And then it spoke. "Welcome home." The voice was twisted, distorted, but unmistakably the same. Sarah staggered back, her heart hammering in her chest. The shadows in the room began to close in, swirling around her like a vortex. And as the darkness tightened, she felt herself pulled toward the other Sarah, the other version of herself. She wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but there was no escape. The other Sarah reached out with cold, bony fingers, brushing Sarah's cheek, and for a brief moment, she saw the truth in the reflection. She wasn't trapped. She had become the house. The walls, the floors, the rooms, they had all fed on her. They had absorbed her, twisted her essence into something new, something darker. And now, she was part of the cycle. "There's no way out." The whisper came from everywhere. From the house. From her. The other Sarah's grin widened, teeth glistening, sharp as knives. And then everything went black. For a moment, Sarah was nothing. No sound. No light. No movement. But then, slowly, painfully, she became aware of herself again. She was alive. The pulse of the house was inside her. Her thoughts were her own, but they were tainted now. She could feel the darkness, the hunger, the need. And as the house continued to breathe around her, she knew the truth. She had become part of it. Forever. And when the next soul wandered too close, when the next unwitting victim ventured into its grasp, she would be there. Waiting. A part of the house. Always hungry. Always watching. Forever. Time had lost its meaning in the house. Moments, or perhaps years, passed without distinction. Sarah, or what was left of her, wandered through the corridors, her steps echoing in the heavy silence. She could no longer tell where her mind ended and the house began. The whispers never stopped. They became part of her now, humming through her veins, vibrating in her chest. She had become a vessel for the house's hunger, its unending need for more. Her reflection followed her in every dark corner. The twisted version of herself smiled back, eyes hollow and dark, but with something sharp and predatory in its gaze. The grin never faded. It was her, but it wasn't. "You're one of us now," the voice whispered. Her footsteps took her through the hallways, past doors that led nowhere, past rooms that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking. She couldn't stop herself. She didn't want to. She had become a part of the house's vast, insidious web. She couldn't remember if she was still Sarah. The name was a distant echo now, as empty as the house itself. But sometimes, late at night, when the shadows grew thick and heavy, she would feel it, the old, familiar fear. A part of her still remembered what it felt like to be human. To escape. But that part of her was fading. The hunger in her chest grew louder, more insistent. It clawed at her insides like a living thing, demanding she feed it, demanding she continue the cycle. The house had always been hungry, but now she was its hunger. She was its voice. Its teeth. And soon, she realized, there would be no more escape. No more wandering. She would never leave. But that didn't mean there weren't others. The house didn't just take lives, it created them. It built new versions, new shadows, new echoes of those it consumed. A girl who wandered too close. A man seeking shelter from the rain. The hungry souls, always lured by the darkness, drawn to the house by its whisper, its promise of safety. And now, she would find them. She would wait in the corners. Watch as they enter the house, desperate, unknowing. And then, she would show them the door. The same door she had walked through. The same door that had led her here. The door to the hunger. She smiled. The house was alive, and so was she. And with every soul it took, it grew stronger. Forever. The house would never stop. It would never stop feeding. It would never stop growing. And neither would she. "Welcome home," she whispered, stepping into the shadows to find her next victim. The house was hungry. And Sarah was ready. Forever. The darkness around her seemed to stretch infinitely, like an ocean of black, swallowing her thoughts, her very essence. Sarah stood at the threshold of the house, now a part of it in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. She had become the house. Her skin felt cold, foreign, as if it no longer belonged to her, but to something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting, watching, and now, finally feasting. It had started slowly, the whispers. At first, they were faint, just a soft murmur in the back of her mind. Then louder, insistent, until they consumed everything. She had heard the house speaking, as it had always spoken, through the walls, the floors, and finally, through her own body. The hunger was insatiable, but now, it was her hunger. Sarah reached out a hand, her fingers grazing the walls of the hallway. The touch was alive. Not just wood and stone, but flesh. It pulsed with a deep, slow rhythm, a heartbeat that was both distant and immediate. The house was breathing, and so was she. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to shout or scream. The house knew. It always knew who belonged and who didn't. The next soul would come, drawn by the call, lured by the illusion of safety. They would knock at the door, they would enter, and the cycle would begin again. Her eyes moved down the hall, to the door at the far end. It was calling her, just as it called to the others. She could feel its pull, its promise of something beyond, something that wasn't quite death, but was worse than anything she had ever known. A prison. A home. A hunger. And just like that, she heard the faintest sound, footsteps, hesitant, far off. The whispers began again, a chorus of voices that weren't her own, yet felt so familiar. "It's time," the house murmured. Sarah's heart, if it could still be called a heart, began to race. She stepped toward the door. The new soul was coming. The house would never stop. It would never be finished. And neither would she. "Welcome home," Sarah whispered. The silence that had hung heavy in the air shattered like glass. The house groaned, a low, dreadful sound that vibrated through Sarah's very bones. Her feet were rooted to the ground, but the walls seemed to press in on her, closing the space, narrowing it until there was only one way forward. The door ahead, her door, stood wide open. It was an invitation, a summons, a final truth. Sarah had stepped into this place once, willingly, unknowingly. And now, there was no turning back. For the briefest of moments, she felt her breath catch in her throat, her heart pounding as if it were still her own. For the first time since the darkness had swallowed her, she remembered the feeling of escape, the hope of freedom that had once driven her. But it was gone now. Gone forever. The house didn't just consume, it shaped. It didn't merely trap souls, it changed them. It twisted them, remade them into something new, something that belonged. And Sarah was no different. She could feel it inside her now, the connection, the bond that tied her to every other soul the house had taken. Her hands trembled as she reached toward the doorframe. The wood was warm, pulsing beneath her fingertips. She closed her eyes, knowing she wasn't alone. The air hummed with energy. The house seemed to breathe with her, around her, through her. She had become a part of it. And then, through the doorway, she saw something. A flicker of movement in the dark. Another figure, standing in the shadow. A soul. A lost soul. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't hesitate. The house had always called to them. The house would always call. She stepped forward, toward the figure. The door creaked shut behind her, sealing her in once more. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, but now Sarah understood them. She understood everything. She was no longer the prey. She was the hunter. And as she moved toward the new soul, she knew this was her home now. The house had claimed her. And it always would. Forever.